Welcome to Historical Currents, where history flows gently, like waves of memory carrying you back to distant eras. The Nile wound its way like a ribbon of green through the golden desert. Thousands of years ago, before pharaohs, before pyramids, this river sustained the small villages of mud and reed where humanity trembled before nature, yet slowly learned how to make it a companion. Before the word pharaoh ever echoed across the sands, there were nameless hands digging canals, planting grain, tending fires beneath starlit skies. They sang told stories, whispered prayers to the sun, the river, and the earth. And in each gesture, each offering and utterance, a civilization began to take shape. The story you'll hear does not begin with thrones or chariots. It starts with the smoke of a cooking fire, the first drop of river water, and the beat of a drum marking harvest time. This is the journey of Egypt, before the pharaohs, an ancient epic born in silence, where dreams of order, faith in the divine, and the yearning for unity slowly crystallized into one of history's greatest empires. Before we begin today's story, if you love history's quiet moments, hit subscribe and follow the journey. The Nile awakened life, sowing the first seeds of Egypt. Dawn spilled into the Nile Valley. The first light of day fell upon water, still veiled in mist, like a great mirror slowly revealing its secrets. No pyramids rose from the sands. No sphinx stood watch. There were no thrones, no crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Only the river, ancient and silent. The boundless earth and sky, as though it had existed long before humanity. The river ran pale and heavy with silt, its current slow and steady. Along the banks, reeds rustled softly, their whispers mingling with the wind. In the distance, the call of cranes echoed across the water, a haunting note that seemed to greet the morning. The scent of damp earth rose from the floodplain, blending with the faint smoke of a fire just kindled in a small riverside village. This was not the Egypt of pharaohs. This was the Egypt of ordinary souls who lived by the river, seeking harmony between the flood and the drought. They had no writing, no vision of dynasties, but already they understood that this river was the lifeline, the thread between life and death. A man sat before his hut of mud and reed his weathered hands, tying a fishing net with hemp cord. He did not know that millennia later, scholars would name his era Pre-Dynastic Egypt. To him, it was simply another morning, and the river needed to provide fish for his family to survive. Across the water, children ran barefoot through the sand, drawing shapes with wooden sticks. A crocodile, a bird, a man holding a spear. They laughed, and their laughter carried on the breeze, a living echo of a time before monuments, when Egypt was just a riverside hamlet filled with children's voices. On a dugout canoe, two young men paddled toward the heart of the stream. The oars dipped and rose in rhythm, like the river's heartbeat. They cast their net, and the morning light shimmered across the surface. Fish leapt silver bodies flashing, then fell into the net with a burst of sound like nature applauding the dawn. As the sun climbed higher, its golden hue deepened into brilliance, and the entire landscape shifted. The riverbank became a tapestry of brown and green, while far beyond the desert stretched endlessly blazing red under the midday sun. Prehistoric Egyptians knew well beyond the burning sands lay death. Life could only take root along the Nile, where the river spilled its fertile silt upon the earth. An older woman from the village lifted a clay jar onto her shoulder. her steps steady along the dirt path. Her coarse linen dress clung to weathered skin, and her calloused feet left deep imprints in the sand. She knew every bend-watering river hole her life had been braided into its current. On her lips, she murmured an ancient song. No instruments, no audience, just a whispered offering to the Nile. By noon, the village fell into silence beneath the blazing sky. A man sat in the shade, sharpening a spearhead with a stone blade. A child beside him watched intently, eyes wide with curiosity, tracking each movement. Elsewhere, women spread rice across woven mats, sifting out grains of sand with practiced hands. The soft rustle of grain flowed like a rhythm, uncomposed yet eternal. Night came swiftly to the desert. The crimson sunset flared across the river, then faded into dusk. Villagers gathered around the fire. The smoke mingled with the scent of grilled fish and earth. Children huddled close, eyes bright with wonder. The elders began to speak stories without script, carried only by voice. Tales of a giant crocodile beneath the waters of a sacred bull, bearing the sun upon its horns of stars that lit the way through the darkness. There was no pharaoh, but the first fragments of a spiritual world had already begun to form. Each star, each creature, each rising flood held meaning. From the innocence of these humble villages, a vast mythology slowly emerged. When the moon rose, casting silver light across the river, the Nile seemed like a metal ribbon linking earth to sky. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked among the reeds, and gentle waves lapped the shore. It was a nighttime symphony. Someone near the fire whispered, "The river is our mother. It gives life to all." No one disagreed, because in that primordial age, the Nile was the only god they knew. And so the first night of this story ends on the image of a small boat moored along the bank, rocking gently in the current. There was no throne, no dynasty, only the river, its people, and a civilization waiting to be awakened. But the Nile was not always generous. There came a time when the sky changed color and the land turned into a test. Winds swept grains of sand across a hazy sky. Few would believe that thousands of years ago, this place was once a vast green pasture stretching to the horizon. Today's Sahara is the remnant of a far-reaching transformation, a climatic upheaval that erased the grasslands and forced humanity to turn to the last surviving current of life, the Nile. In that distant age, herds of elephants, giraffes, and rhinos roamed this ground. Their heavy footsteps thundered across the savanna dust, rising behind them like smoke. Moonlight shimmered on clear lakes. Birds gathered along the shores, and humans hunted in what must have felt like a natural paradise. But the skies shifted. The rains retreated. Lakes dried, and the winds carried an ever-growing heat. A nomadic boy stood on a hill looking westward. Sand had swallowed the path his clan once traveled. By noon, their footprints were gone. He heard his father sigh. "The grasslands are dying." In that voice lay not just sorrow, but the dawning awareness that life itself was being rewritten. And so in that moment, the Nile became a refuge. As floodwaters surged down from the distant Ethiopian highlands, each season the parched earth was cloaked anew in fertile silt. The soil turned deep black, soft beneath bare feet, rich with the scent of moisture. people began carving narrow canals to hold the water, lifting handfuls of wet earth as if it were a gift from the gods. The sound of the flood wasn't like thunder, nor as violent as the crashing sea. It was low, steady, resonant, like the earth exhaling. First came the gentle trickle through small channels, then the rush sweeping over sandy banks, pulling dry grass and tangled roots with it. And finally silence as the water settled and left behind a blank canvas ready to cradle the seeds of life. It was no accident that the ancient Egyptians called the fertile land by the river Kemet the Black Land. In stark contrast stood Dishret, the Red Land, the vast, lifeless desert. Black and red were not just the colors of the earth. They were the eternal duality of life and death order and chaos of balance every ritual sought to preserve. Between these two worlds, humanity was forced to choose dwell in the embrace of silt and water, or vanish into the sea of sand. A group of farmers built huts along the riverbank, their eyes fixed on every signal the water offered. They learned to read the moon measure, shadows cast by the sun, and remember each flood season like a sacred rhythm. There were no stone tablets, no written words, but in their memory, each cycle of the Nile became a heartbeat for survival. A village child might not yet know how to weave a net, but could recite their mother's words without pause. The water rose high this year. There will be much grain. Across the river, the land had already begun to crack. Nomads, with no pasture left for their goats, and sheep drifted closer to the water's edge in search of shelter. Tensions flared. A settled village spotted the newcomers, bows on their backs, spears in hand, and understood the banks of the Nile were not wide enough for all. But the river flowed on indifferent to human quarrels. Patient and eternal, it gave it withdrew, leaving humanity to wrestle with the question of how to share its gifts. In the stillness of late afternoon, the river turned into a sheet of flame, reflecting the sun's fading blaze. One could see birds gliding overhead from the far bank and flooded fields shimmering like polished bronze. The village elder, his voice low murmured, "Without the Nile, we are nothing but sand." It wasn't a proverb, it was a truth. Night fell. The sky was crystalline and full of stars like a silver tapestry unfurled. The young people sat by the shore, listening to the water's soft lapping, comforted yet uneasy. Comforted by the returning silt, they uneasily wonder whether the river will keep its rhythm next year. Small fires flickered along the bank, their reflections dancing on the surface like tiny souls pleading for the Nile's protection. The Nile Valley, then, was never just a strip of land. It was the frontier between life and death, the cradle of memory, the forge of resilience. Long before pharaohs claimed divine right climate and current shaped a people teaching them to lean on one another, to pray, to dream of a future, not alone, but together. From those damp, silty banks, small communities began to rise, fragile, yes, but unwavering. Morning didn't begin with the sunrise, but with the steady thump of pestles crushing grain. The sound echoed through the village, woven into the bark of dogs and the flapping wings of wildfowl. Smoke curled upward from round mud brick homes with reed-thatched roofs, fragile in appearance, yet resilient against the desert wind. The scent of coarse barley bread freshly baked drifted into the air, mingling with the damp earth. to form the unmistakable fragrance of an ancient Egyptian dawn. A child sat outside, hands caked in dirt, giggling as they shaped small bricks from clay. Not far away, a woman pressed wet earth mixed with straw into wooden molds, laying them out beneath the sun. This wasn't just play. It was the village expanding brick by brick, wall by wall, a quiet testament to humanity's enduring claim upon the land. At the village center, a broad courtyard served as a gathering place. Men repaired bronze plow blades, precious tools acquired through distant trade, while women pulled flax into fine threads for weaving. The loom creaked in a calming rhythm, steady and slow, like a lullaby for the soul. An elder stepped into the square, holding a simple wooden instrument, just a few taut strings stretched over a frame. He plucked them gently. No complex melody, just long, lingering notes that drifted with the wind. And yet something about the sound made heads turn. For a fleeting moment, the entire village seemed to breathe as one. By noon, the sun poured down from above. Children dashed to the riverbank, splashing each other with cool water, their laughter slicing through the heavy heat. Up on higher ground, herds grazed cattle, goats, sheep. Not merely food, but wealth, status, the lifeblood of survival. A herdsman sang a low rhythmic chant, and the animals moved in time as if lulled by his voice. Meanwhile, back in the village, a pot of barley beer simmered over the fire. The tang of fermentation and roasted grains' toasty scent rose thick in the air. A woman stirred the pot, sweat glistening on her brow, but her eyes shone with quiet pride, knowing this simple brew would quench the thirst of an entire community. Beer humble, yet foundational. A drink that refreshed not just the body, but the bonds between those who shared it. As evening fell, the villagers gathered in the courtyard. A young man had just returned from afar, carrying a pouch filled with shells from the Red Land, tiny treasures destined to become ornaments. Eager eyes surrounded him. In a world untouched by gold or silver, such humble objects held the weight of riches. Children scrambled to touch them, feeling the cool smoothness beneath their fingertips. Night returned, and once again, the flames rose. But this time, it wasn't just for stories. A small ritual was to be shared. The village elder, not a king, merely the most respected among them, stepped forward. He lifted a cup of beer, offering one part to the earth, one to the fire, and one to the river. The crowd stood in silence. The only sound was the wind hissing through the reed-thatched roofs. And in that moment, the village felt tethered to something greater, a rhythm beyond the ordinary flow of life. Children began to doze on their mothers' shoulders, dogs curled by the fire. The older man struck a few soft notes on his instrument, the sound drifting into the night, mingling with the chirping of insects and the distant murmur of the river. The village felt held as if wrapped in an unseen embrace. There were no walls, no guards, but there was unity, a shared memory, and rhythm of being. In the darkness, one could see the shape of the very first village, small, delicate, yet strong in its own quiet way. It did not yet know it was laying the foundation for an empire that would endure millennia. But with every earthen brick song sung and beer sip passed hand to hand, something extraordinary was beginning. In that rhythm, sound became spirit music, was no longer just joy, but a bridge between humankind and the divine. Night in the village was never truly silent. When the sun withdrew and shadows took place, another symphony began. The music of life. Drums stretched tight with animal hide echoed into the dark, joined by clapping hands and stomping feet. In the circle of firelight, these people, who had yet to invent writing, discovered a different language music. The flames danced high in the open space at the village's heart, casting a golden glow across faces still lit with the energy of a day's labor. At the center sat a drum, a simple wooden frame, a hide top. A young man stepped forward, calloused hands striking the first beat. The sound rippled outward, resonating through chests and pulling each listener into a shared breath, a collective rhythm. A young woman picked up two smooth stones, clicking them together. The sharp clink rang out like raindrops on sun-baked earth. A child nearby burst into laughter and copied her, and soon more small hands joined in. The circle pulsed, the thunder of drums, the chime of stones, the clapping of hands rising and falling like waves of sound. Here music needed no audience. Every soul was a participant. Every beat, every voice belonged. The village elder, quiet by day, suddenly raised his voice in a deep haunting chant, drawn out like wind through a stone cavern. The drumming paused for a heartbeat, then rose, lifting his song higher. The fire flared its red light, reflected in the eyes of those gathered eyes, filled with joy and reverence. As the rhythm quickened, a group of youths stepped into the ring. Their bodies swayed, their feet struck the ground in sync with the beat. Dust kicked up around them, catching the firelight swirling into a glowing red mist that wrapped the dancers like a veil. Children squealed, women laughed, and elders nodded along. The boundaries of age, labor, and status dissolved at that moment. They were one people bound in one pulse. This music didn't just pass through the ears, it moved through the body. Each drum beat struck the chest, syncing with the heartbeat. Bare feet pressed into the cool earth, drumming with the rhythm of the land itself. The heat of breath, the scent of smoke and sweat and fermenting beer merged in the air. The night became a festival of the senses, where sound, smell, touch, and motion joined in sacred celebration. Then a young man stepped forward, drawing a flute carved from the hollow bone of a bird. He raised it to his lips and blew a series of piercing ethereal notes, high and clear, cutting through the beat of the drums, sailing into the night. The sound was as light as wind, yet carried a different kind of power. It slowed. The dancers drew every gaze toward its source. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though something unseen was listening. A child perched on his father's shoulders whispered, "Who is listening to our song?" The father did not answer, only tightened his grip around the boy's hand. But the question lingered in every heart. Could it be that there was a presence beyond human reach within the rhythm of drums and the cry of the flute? Perhaps this was when music ceased to be a mere celebration and became something more ritual. No longer just for joy, it became a bridge between the human and the divine. A mother tilted her head, eyes glistening in the firelight, whispering a silent prayer. And through the music, her words seemed to take shape, giving form to the invisible, reminding everyone that they were not alone in the dark. The night wore on, the drums softened, the voices quieted, and the fire sank into glowing embers. But the music didn't end. It echoed in memory, in the heartbeat, in the weary but warm breath of those walking back to their shelters. Their feet still carried the rhythm. Their lips still hummed the song. Music had become a collective memory, one not written in stone, but etched into the soul. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, the men would return to their plows, the women to their spinning, the children to the riverbank. But when night returned, the circle of music would form again. And so the rhythm would repeat, carving itself deeper into the spirit, nurturing the sense that they belonged to one another and to something greater. This small village had no walls, no written laws, but it had a shared drumbeat, a shared song. That was their first constitution, an unwritten code that bound them together. And if you listen more closely, you'll hear that music was also the first call toward the divine. The flute's soaring cry, the voice's deep chant, the drum's echo against the earth. They were not just sound, but an unconscious ritual, a bridge stretched between man and sky. And from that bridge, the first seeds of belief were sown, awaiting the stories that would one day become legend. That night, the Egyptian sky stretched endlessly like a boundless tapestry. Countless stars were strewn across it, twinkling radiant as if close enough to touch. Beneath that cosmic dome, small fires flickered from scattered bundles of wood. Between these two visions, the infinite heavens above and the fragile flames below humanity could sense the contrast, how small, how vulnerable they were in the face of unseen forces. And from that realization, the first stirrings of faith were born. By day they looked to the sun, too brilliant to gaze upon directly. Its light brought the harvest, warmed their skin, and burned and withered the fields. The ancients called it the Father in the sky, a power far beyond their command. And when dusk fell and the sun vanished, their hearts tightened with unease. Would the god return come morning? They turned to the moon at night, its glow softer, cooler, a gentle guide across the desert sands. The moon faded and reappeared, changing from complete to sliver and back again. To them, it was the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. With every rising moon, their belief in life's unending rhythm grew stronger. It wasn't only the celestial that hinted at divinity. The creatures around them seemed touched by gods. A crocodile surfaced from the river, its golden eyes glowing in the dark, its teeth white and sharp as blades. The villagers trembled but bowed low, leaving grilled fish at the water's edge. It was a gesture of fear and reverence, a plea for protection, a prayer not to be harmed. The wild bull with horns curved like crescent moons became another sacred symbol. Proud and powerful, it gave meat-pulled plows and shook the earth with its charge. The children cheered when a bull kicked up dust, and the elders whispered, "That is the strength of the gods." Even the earliest carvings began to take shape. Bulls bearing the sun, crocodiles swallowing the moon, falcons soaring among the stars. On moonlit nights, the villagers gathered along the riverbank. They laid out a few loaves, cups of beer, and sometimes strips of dried meat. No one demanded it, but each person placed a small portion of their own before the fire or the flowing water. The smoke from charred offerings spiraled upward, dissolving into the night. It was a message to them, sent to the invisible powers above. An older woman tossed a handful of dry grass into the fire, sending a column of smoke spiraling into the sky. A child beside her asked, "Does the smoke carry our words?" She nodded gently, the firelight flickering in her eyes. In the stillness of night, belief passed silently from one generation to the next, not through written words, but through glances, gestures, and the sacred repetition of ritual. As with the night before, music played its part in the ceremony. The drum beat slowed, no longer pulsing with the energy of dance. It thudded like the heartbeat of the earth, each strike a whispered prayer. The bone flute gave voice to a long, haunting melody, as if calling out to gods hidden in the shadows. The elders sang in low, raspy voices, naming the bull, the crocodile, the bird. And those names, repeated repeatedly, began to shift from creatures of flesh and blood into symbols, and from symbols into myth. In that moment, people began to see the world with dual vision. The world of reality, of crocodiles, bulls, and the sun, and the world of divinity, of Sobek Apis and Ra. The mythological world was still forming, but its seeds had been sown. From those seeds, Egypt would one day craft a vast and intricate belief system that would endure for millennia. They did not yet know how to write. They had built no temples, but they already knew how to tremble at thunder, rejoice when the floodwaters came, and lift their faces in awe as the sun rose. That fear and hope, woven with music, ritual, and story, became the foundation of mythology. As the ceremony ended, the fire faded into glowing embers. Yet in the eyes of those gathered, the stars above seemed closer now, as if someone or something were watching. They believed the gods had heard, and that belief made them stronger, ready to face whatever came next. But the subsequent trial would not come from the natural world. It would come from within. For once, faith in the gods had taken root. Humankind began to believe they could speak in the gods' name and wield sword and spear on their behalf. And from that belief, the first blood would be spilled upon the riverbank. The first battles and memories were carved into stone and the human soul. Morning on the Nile was still. The river's surface lay smooth as glass, but along its banks the air hung heavy. Two groups stood apart, each from a different village and world. Between them, no trade, no laughter, only eyes locked in suspicion. And for the first time, weapons were no longer meant for beasts, but for each other. A young man stood among the ranks. His fingers clenched the shaft of a wooden spear, its flint tip honed to a deadly point. It was the first time he had held a weapon not to hunt, but to face another human. His hand trembled. He glanced at his father, stern-eyed, unflinching, a silent well of strength. The old man's words from the night before echoed in his mind. We fight not only for land, but for the gods who guard it. That promise steadied him, but it also pressed heavily on his chest. The tension pulled taut, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Then came the drumbeat, far off, solemn, not the joyful rhythm of nights past, but a slow, thunderous call. The hour had come. With each beat, the young man's chest tightened. Desert wind swept in flinging sand into his eyes, burning them. For a moment, visions filled his mind. The sacred bull, the river's crocodile. Were they watching now, judging who among them deserved to live? Then the first war cry rang out. A spear flew slicing through the air, plunging into the sand between the two sides. Silence shattered, shouts pounding feet, and the clash of weapons erupted across the riverside. The young man surged forward with the others. Hot sand splashed against his face. Sweat and dust filled his lungs. Across from him, another youth, no older than himself, rushed forward. Their eyes met a fleeting moment, not of hatred, but of recognition, a mirror image. But the spear was already raised. The heartbeat drove him forward. The sounds blurred together, wood cracking against wood stone, shattering screams, splitting the sky. Someone fell. Blood soaked into the sand, red and vivid under the unforgiving sun. The young man stumbled back, heart pounding like thunder. For the first time, he saw human blood on the soil of his homeland. The iron scent hit his nostrils, twisting his stomach into knots. Then a hand slammed against his back, his father's. Still fighting, still shouting for the river, for the land, for the gods, that cry tore through him like a sudden wind. The young man clenched his teeth, hurled all his strength into his spear, and charged. The world blurred, nothing remained but the roar of voices, the searing heat, and the relentless shock of bodies colliding. By the time the sun reached its peak, the battle had raged for hours. Dust blanketed the land, masking even the river's edge. On the ground, bodies lay still, while the survivors stood panting, their eyes bloodshot. No one cheered. No one celebrated. There was only silence, heavy and raw, and the inescapable truth: humankind had learned to kill its own for land and in the name of the gods. The young man sank to the ground, still clutching his spear, but his eyes were clouded with sweat, with tears. He looked to the river, flowing quietly as ever, unmoved by the blood now staining its sands. A question formed in his mind. Did the gods honestly want this? But he dared not speak it aloud. Around him, the others whispered that this victory was a sign the gods were on their side. By dusk, the fallen were carried home. The villagers laid stones, offered food, and poured beer upon the graves. Drums rang out once more, but now in mourning, slow, heavy grieving. Mothers wept in silence. Children clung to their fathers' tunics. The young man bowed his head and understood, for the first time, war was not like the hunt. A dead animal fed the village. A dead man left a void that would never be filled. That night, he sat by the river, staring at the star-filled sky, straining to hear the wind. He wanted to believe the gods had accepted their blood offering, but deep inside, all he heard was the cold, steady murmur of the Nile, unchanging, unfeeling. The first war was over, but it had left something behind, something that would not fade. Humanity had discovered how to use belief to sanctify violence, and from that moment forward, the land of Egypt would witness not only harvests and holy days, but bloodshed again and again. The first carvings began to emerge on a riverside cliff beneath the pale gold light of late afternoon. A rough hand gripped a sharp-edged stone, slowly scraping it across the hard surface. White lines appeared one after another, forming the shape of an antelope in mid-stride, a shadowy figure with a spear close behind. There was no color, no excess detail, just simple strokes. Yet in that simplicity, memory was preserved, the memory of the hunt. A child sat nearby, eyes wide. He watched his father etch the open jaws of a crocodile, his uncle carve a scene of rowers rowing down the river. The boy didn't yet understand the whole meaning, but something stirred in him, a sense that what happened today, if carved into stone, could outlive even the people who lived it. Marks began to appear on the modest graves as well. Beyond food and beer offerings, they painted in red and black colors drawn from earth and charcoal. A circle with rays stretching outward the sun. A pair of curved horns, the wild bull. These were not yet written words, but symbols, the first steps toward meaning. In the stillness of the afternoon, women sat beside the fire, a shard of pottery in one hand, a stick in the other, drawing onto the damp earth. But what they etched was not gods or beasts. They drew dancers' figures holding hands in a circle. Art was not just for remembering victories, it was for capturing joy and holding on to life's rhythm. The sound of stone carving rang sharp and high, like insects in the summer heat. But as the images came into focus, the watchers fell silent, then nodded. No one needed to explain. They understood this was how they would remember. This was how they would tell the story to those who had not seen it. One slab bore a striking scene, two groups facing off, spears and staffs raised. It was not a hunt, but the memory of the battle by the river. One figure lay, fallen arms, outstretched, crude lines, yet brimming with force. Those who had been there knew immediately. Those who hadn't could still imagine. War, for the first time, had found an image that would endure. The village elders would say, "Stone remembers longer than we do. When we are gone, the stone will remain." The words rang out simple yet profound, for in that moment, humanity had found a way to outlast the fragility of life. Each carving, each painted line was more than art. It was a bridge between generations. A child learned to name the animals from the rock face, recognize the gods through symbols, and grasp the past through the scenes engraved in stone. Before writing existed, art was the shared language of memory. On the sandbanks at sunset, the carving of a man rowing a boat caught the red glow of the dying light and seemed to move. Perhaps the ancients saw it too, how as the light shifted, the figures appeared to come alive. And so they believed that within those images, the spirit of the moment, the soul of the beast, the essence of the person still lingered. At night, the stories returned to the fire. But now, the storyteller pointed not to the stars, but to the stone. Children watched their eyes tracing the white lines. The tales and the images merged, spoken and visual memory becoming one. In that quiet reverence, art began to take on its most actual purpose, to make humans believe they could defy death. Their memories would endure in stone, in the walls of a tomb, in unyielding but straightforward images. And then, once they learned to carve, to draw, they began to hunger for more. If a cliffside could hold a hunt, a battle, could it not also have a name, a lineage, the strength of a leader? That question would lead them to the next great leap. The beginning of power engraved the birth of symbols that would define authority. At dawn, in a village by the Nile, the rhythmic pounding of grain echoed through the air. It came not from the hands of men, but from women calloused hands, slender yet unyielding. Each strike was a heartbeat, sustaining the pulse of an entire community. Their silhouettes emerged through the haze of kitchen smoke, quiet, unboastful, enduring like the river itself. In pre-dynastic Egypt, women did not stand behind. They were the sowers, the keepers, the sacred thread between earth and life. When the floods receded and the black earth was laid bare, women stepped into the fields, scattering seeds into the furrows. They knew how to feel the moisture in the soil and choose the moment when the mud was soft but not too wet. Those seeds, barley, millet, lentils, were the village's promise of survival. A barefoot child ran along the sandy bank, cupping tiny hands to receive a handful of grain from his mother. He dropped the seeds into the ground, giggling. It was his first lesson, not in words, not on tablets, but through gestures repeated for generations. The mother whispered, "The seed must lie in the belly of the earth, just as you once lay in mine. Only then can life be born." In that simple phrase lay a cosmic truth. Women brought life to the land, just as they brought life into the world. They were not only planters, but guardians of memory. In the evenings around the fire, as men told tales of the hunt and the battlefield, the women filled in the details and ensured the story stayed true. They remembered who had fallen, which year the floods were highest, and how long the droughts had lasted. Through their voices, communal memory became durable. One afternoon, a group of women sat spinning flax by the river. There were no looms yet, just hands twisting strands, stretching them thin under the sun, then weaving them into rough cloth. Each thread was spun with countless repeated motions, and each fabric became a testament to patience, as if they were weaving time itself. A husband would wrap himself in that fabric as he stepped into the fields, carrying the warmth and labor of his wife. In ritual, their role was even more pronounced. They scattered grain into the fire. They sang the sacred songs that summoned the gods. Their voices, clear, high, unwavering, rose above the deep drums of the men. And when night came, when drums and flutes began their chant, the women's voices gave the ritual its soul. At times, one would stand at the circle's center, holding a cup of beer, lifting it to the river. At that moment, she was no longer just a wife or mother. She was the vessel between humankind and the divine. The elders whispered that when conflict arose, a woman's voice could bring battle to a halt. Men marched to the river's edge with spears and blades. But if a woman stepped forward, child in arms, and placed herself between them sometimes, the spears would lower. In her gaze was a power not of muscle, but of continuity of life carried forward. Children often gathered around the village grandmother. Sitting on a woven mat, silver-haired, she spoke of the time when grasslands stretched wide and herds of elephants and antelopes still roamed. She held no weapons, wielded no authority, but her voice was a thread binding generations. A child would listen and one day tell the story anew. In this way, women were living vaults of memory. At funerals, it was the women's cries that echoed through the village. Not mere sorrow, but sacred ritual. Their weeping was believed to guide the dead's souls to the gods' realm, like birds charting a path through the sky. Without that cry, it was said the spirit would wander lost. Women did not only bear life, they shepherded the soul through death. One day, a young man returned from war, eyes still horrified. His mother asked nothing and offered no rebuke. She placed a beer bowl before him and gently rested her hand on his shoulder. In that touch, fear eased. Perhaps that is why, among the countless ancient figurines of early Egypt, The image most often found is that of a woman with complete breasts and a rounded belly. This was not a chance. It was a symbol of life, of memory, of enduring belief. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village fell into shadow. But a mother's lullaby rose within each hut, soft, slow, steady. The child drifted into sleep, heartbeat sinking to the rhythm of her song. And on some deeper level, the entire village rested under that same spell, held safe by the silent presence of its women. Their place was not the battlefield nor the throne, yet they laid the foundation upon which everything stood. If men raised the wooden pillars, women were the earth that held them upright. If men plowed the soil, women were the seed. And if men fell, women were what remained the memory, the voice. So when we look back to early Egypt, we must see them clearly, the women with hardened hands who nurtured, preserved, and bound the community together. They were the invisible pillars, the thread stitching the human fabric. From those hands, seeds planted into black soil would one day grow power and order. But there were mothers, sisters, and wives before the throne and the crown who kept Egypt's soul alive. Heavy footsteps pressed into the dry sand. The caravan stretched in a long, winding line, each person bearing a bulging sack across their shoulders. Rope bit into skin, leaving red welts. Sweat ran in rivulets down their backs. At the front, a shaggy, dust-covered donkey brayed hoarsely, protesting the weight strapped to its back. But it wasn't carrying game or meat. It bore salt, flint ivory things that could not be eaten, yet held the power to be traded for life. Beside them, the Nile flowed steadily. Reed boats skimmed the surface, their hulls piled with baskets of grain, beer jugs, and flax cloth rolls. A rower held his paddle firm, eyes fixed on the shore, watching the caravan march in sync with his stroke. Two worlds, one on water, one on land, racing together toward a distant market. A young boy followed his father wide-eyed on his first journey. His gaze danced over the bundles they carried. In one, he found strange green stones, cold to the touch. His father explained they came from far-off mountains to be polished into beads and traded for grain. The boy didn't understand why a useless stone was so precious, but his eyes lit up at the thought of bringing home a small necklace for his mother. Voices stirred among the travelers. They spoke of villages flush with surplus grain, others desperate for salt to cure meat. One man told of places even farther away, where people had gold-fragrant oils and rare woods. For a moment, silence followed. Each mind wandered, dreaming of goods never seen, as if listening to tales from another world. The earth had been leveled at the trading grounds, and reed shelters were thrown up in haste. There were no coins, no scales, only barter. A basket of grain for a strip of linen. A copper axe for 10 jars of beer. One man held up a shard of flint, turned it in the sunlight, then nodded. No parchment, no contract. That nod was the deal. The boy wove through the crowd. Laughter rang out, mingling with the bleating of goats and the patter of barefoot children. The air was alive, unlike the quiet of home. And in that place, amid trade voices and the shimmer of goods, he began to understand he belonged not just to his small village, but to something far greater. A web of life, of exchange, of civilization taking shape. A boat had just docked. On board, a sailor unwrapped a bundle of animal hide, revealing shimmering green stones, malachite soon to be ground into eye paint. The women gathered, eyes lit with wonder. None could have guessed that an entire aesthetic, an emblem of identity, would one day emerge from these tiny stones. That night, as the market faded into silence, those who remained lit fires and shared stories. They spoke of the long road of the arid lands to the west, where other wandering bands roamed. The boy leaned against his father's shoulder, eyelids heavy, but even in his drowsiness, he saw it still, the gleam of precious stones, like fallen stars scattered across the earth. In that moment, trade was more than the exchange of goods. It became a window opening minds, stretching imagination beyond the village's boundaries. From hunting spears to copper axes, from seashells to green gems, from beer to incense, each object became a thread weaving people together across lands and rivers. By morning, the caravan was prepared to return. Their loads were lighter now, but their eyes carried something new, a quiet belief that the world was larger than they had ever known. And in the boy's mind, a question began to stir. If stones, spears, and cloth could be traded, then could memory, a name, even the soul itself be exchanged, so that something of us might last beyond a lifetime? Night fell over the riverbank, but the drums no longer pounded with the joy of celebration. In their place came the deep wavering sound of mourning. A man had fallen after a clash on the edge of the fields. His body lay on a mat of woven reeds covered with coarse linen. Around him, flickering flames cast long shadows of those kneeling hands raised to their faces in silent grief. The village women raised their voices in a long, piercing cry, a wail that tore through the night. It was believed that such cries did more than express sorrow. They opened a path for the soul, guiding it toward the next world. Every tear that touched the earth was a final farewell, soaking into the soil like a sacred offering. No one allowed the dead to vanish into silence. A grave was dug beside the river. The earth was damp thick with the scent of silt. The body was laid on its side, and the head turned west toward the setting sun, the direction from which they believed the soul began its journey to the beyond. Familiar objects were placed upon the body: a small jar of beer, a piece of dry bread, a flint blade, and a few shell beads. These were not tokens of status, but provisions for the road ahead, so the departed would not walk empty-handed into the unknown. A child stood, watching eyes wide. He did not yet understand why the dead needed knives or bread, but his mother's tearful eyes and the low chant in her voice kept him still. Somehow, he sensed this was a ritual, and that ritual meant more than reason. Over the grave, they laid reeds in bundles, forming a simple roof. That night, the fire crackled smoke, rising high into the dark. The villagers gathered. No one spoke loudly. Only whispers flowed stories of past floods, how the fallen man once mended nets with uncommon skill, and the day he pulled a drowning child from the river's wrath. One tale followed another, like threads unspooling, drawing his memory back from the shadows, keeping him alive within the heart of the community. The next day, a stone slab was dragged to the grave and laid upon it. On its surface, a young villager took a sharp piece of flint and carved images: a boat, a few fish, a circle for the sun. There were no words, but the symbols said enough. The man buried here had lived by the river, fished its waters, and worshipped the sun. And thus, One of the earliest graves became not just a resting place, but a vessel of memory, held not only by a family, but the entire village. From that moment on, burial was no longer just the hiding of a body. It became a declaration: we do not vanish, we leave a trace. Every grave is a testament proof that humans understood death and refused to be forgotten by it. And from there, a shift began. Some graves held more offerings, more stones, finer linen. Whispers followed. Perhaps this soul held greater worth and needed more for the journey beyond. And so the faint outlines of hierarchy emerged, soft at first, but undeniable, etched in the earth itself. In this new landscape, a mother placed her young son on her knee, pointed to the freshly covered grave, and whispered, "Someday when I am gone, you will lay me down like this. And remember, place a grain of wheat in my hand." The child nodded, still innocent, but his eyes carried a quiet weight. The air was still, the river flowed on indifferent. But within the hearts of the villagers, something had changed. Death was no longer the end. It was another journey. And the grave, no longer a hole in the ground, became a doorway. Years passed. The shallow pit became a mound. The mound, molded by hand, turned into sun-dried brick walls, the earliest mastabas. On them, carvings multiplied, deeper, finer, more deliberate. And so, step by step, humanity laid the foundation of a tradition that would outlive even their grandest hopes. The tradition of tomb building, venerating death, and believing in immortality. Night fell. The fires lit once more. Elders gathered children, pointing toward the stone etched with the image of a boat. Stories were told of the man beneath it, and in the child's eyes, awe shimmered. He did not know that thousands of years from now, his descendants would raise monuments to do the same, but on a scale 1,000 times greater. That first grave, humble, hand-hewn, was the cornerstone of an entire civilization obsessed with death and the everlasting. And from that point on, Egypt's world no longer turned solely on the rhythms of flood harvest or riverside trade. It spun on a second axis, life and death. But as people began to pour time and labor into their tombs, they faced a new truth. Resources were limited. Land was finite, and not everyone would be buried the same. And from that inequality, new tensions would rise, not with nature, but with each other. And this time, it would not be the gods who shaped injustice. It would be the hands of man. From humble villages, power arose, paving the way for an emerging state. Winds swept in from the desert, carrying a dry and scorching heat. The sky was no longer clear blue, but dimmed by a haze of dust. Days passed, and though the Nile still flowed, its waters no longer rose as before. Once rich with dark silt, the fertile banks now revealed cracked and barren soil. Young shoots withered upon the ground, their leaves curling yellow beneath the burning sun. In the village, the grain jars were opened more frequently. The rice dwindled fast. Mothers rationed more tightly, pressing food into their children's hands before chewing quietly on scraps of coarse bread. The cries of hungry children silenced conversation, for everyone knew there wasn't much left in the granary. At night, the fire still flickered, but there was no sweet scent of beer. Only a thin gruel simmered, ladled into small bowls. The elders gave up their share, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the riverbank, and they whispered, "Have the gods turned away from us?" That question spread like a shadow, settling heavily on every back and every breath. But nature wasn't the only force tightening its grip. Nearby villages, also facing scarcity, began to eye one another suspiciously. One night, the grain store of a riverside hamlet was ransacked. Footprints led away toward a small village downstream. Rage ignited. Men gathered at the river's edge, shouting into the dark, demanding their food be returned. Two sides faced each other. Eyes blazed. Wooden spears and stone axes rose once more. Shouts split the night, not for gods or honor, but for bread, for survival. Children screamed as they watched their parents clash. Those cries echoed like a curse, an accusation against the helplessness of an entire people. A young man who had once helped bury the dead in that first humble grave stood frozen, heart clenched. He remembered his mother's words, "A seed is life," but now the seed had become the spark of hatred. And he wondered, had the earth itself, once the great giver of life, become the very reason for men to destroy one another? Day after day, the arguments grew louder and the clashes became more frequent. Merchant caravans, once passing freely, now skirted the region with caution. Rumors spread like wind. Their men kill for a grain sack. And though it chilled those who heard it, each knew in their heart that their turn could come tomorrow. In that atmosphere, a new need began to take shape. The need for someone to stand between chaos and order. Not the gods, not the vague will of the community, but a man, a leader. One night, a broad-shouldered figure stepped forward as tempers flared once more. In his hands, a heavy staff. He slammed it to the ground. The sound cut through the shouts. Silence fell. His voice rolled like thunder. If we continue like this, no grain will be left for anyone. Someone must hold the balance. All eyes turned toward him. In the firelight, he loomed tall, a leopard skin draped across his shoulders. No one spoke a word of protest. In that moment, they understood to survive, they needed a voice louder than the rest, a hand strong enough to halt the spiral of chaos. The climate had changed. The land had grown harsh. Conflict spread like fire. And yet from within that crucible, a new figure emerged, the first leader, not merely a man of strength, but one who held a different power, the power to impose order. And so, Egypt began to cross into another era, in which people no longer looked only to the gods, but to one another, searching for the one who would rise above the rest. The fire crackled in the dark, casting long shadows against the reed walls. The village sat in silence, wearied by a day of tension and quarrel. The granaries were low, the land shrinking, and the arguments seemed endless. But this time, instead of raised voices, one man stood. He was tall and broad, with a leopard skin draped across his shoulders. In his hand, a heavy wooden staff, rough but resolute. When he drove it into the ground, the sound echoed deep, and all fell still. His voice came low and thunderous. If we keep fighting, nothing will be left for anyone. There must be one among us to hold order, to divide fairly. The crowd looked to one another, then back to him. In their eyes flickered both fear and hope. Fear for power had for the first time gathered into the hands of a single man. Hope for perhaps at last they might escape the chaos. From that night on, he became the voice of the people. He was no king. He wore no crown. But his word was enough to lower raised spears. In dispute, he became the judge. In the division of grain, he held the invisible scales. And in the eyes of the village, he was no longer just the strong one, he was the leader. One day, two villages clashed over a strip of riverbank. They gathered on the sands, spears and axes lifted high. But before blood was spilled, the leader stepped in. Staff in hand, he stood between them, his back straight, his eyes steady. And he said, "The land belongs to the river. It belongs to no village. We only borrow it. This season, one side plants first, next season the other." His words were simple, yet no one objected. They knew without them, there would only be bodies. A child watched him, from afar, eyes wide with awe. He whispered to his mother, "He's like a god." She gently shook her head. "Not a god, but he speaks with a god's voice." In that quiet reply, the seed of sacred authority was planted, for the people had begun to see their leader, not just as a man, but as the earthly keeper of cosmic order. He did not lead only in disputes, but in ritual as well. When offerings were poured into the river, it was he who lifted the first cup of beer. When the people prayed for rain, it was he who struck the drum. Music, once the shared voice of the community, had now turned around him, and so his authority rested not only on strength, but on symbol, on ceremony, and on faith. One evening, as a caravan of merchants docked their boats, they asked, "With whom shall we trade?" Without a word, the entire village turned its eyes to him. From that moment, his power stretched beyond his people. He had become the face of the village to the outside world. Yet power always has two sides. Some whispered, "Why does he give more grain to them?" Others muttered, "He keeps the finest beer for his own house." Whether truth or rumor, the whispers revealed one truth: where power gathers, suspicion is born. That night, he sat alone by the riverbank. Moonlight traced his face, now aged by the weight of strain. Staring into the waters, he whispered, "I am only a man, but they ask me to be more." In his eyes lay both pride and fear. Pride, for he knew he held order together. Fear, for he knew that once a man held power, every gaze would follow him, and every fault would grow larger than life. Yet his presence was necessary. Without him, chaos would return. Because of him, for the first time, people realized that authority could rest in one person, and that a community could revolve around a single center. When he died, his funeral was unlike any before. Not only his family, but the entire village came. They buried him in a larger grave, with more offerings, knives, beer cloth, even a few precious stones. They raised a wooden post, hung a leopard skin, and carved the image of a staff upon a stone slab. To them, he was not merely a man who had lived, but a symbol that must endure. The child who once watched him had grown and stood gazing at the tomb. He whispered, "You will live forever, for the stone will remember you." And so it was. From such small traces, history began inscribing the image of the first leader. Not yet a god, not a king, but the seed of concentrated power of one who stood above the many. In the crimson light of sunset, the chieftain's tomb shone with a solemn aura. And from that moment, Egypt was no longer a scatter of villages. It had stepped onto the path of power, leadership, and gathering. But where there is a leader, there will also be challengers. And the shadow of power's struggle began to rise, opening a new chapter, the passage from chieftain to king. The village slipped into a strange quiet after the leader's tomb was covered. Fires still burned at night, drums still echoed, but in every heart there lay a gap that could not easily be filled. The man who once judged disputes lifted the ceremonial cup and stood between warring factions, now lay silent beneath the soil. The community realized there was no longer a center of order. And when a center falls, the surrounding circles begin to waver. At first, the disturbance took the form of whispers. A man sitting beside a grain jar quietly said, "I once accompanied the leader to the market. I know how trade truly works." Another countered, "No, I am the one who guards the storehouse. I know how to divide it." Those words spoken in the darkness were small but spread fast like sparks caught in the wind. Soon, words turned into deeds. Young men gathered around the storekeeper, helping him protect the dwindling grain. Another band rallied behind the man who traveled to far-off markets, trusting in his access to wealth. In the same village, two factions formed, eyes no longer filled with neighborly regard, but opposition. One morning, a woman came for her share of grain. The storekeeper's voice rang stern. "This is your portion and nothing more." The woman's reply cut through the air. If the leader were still alive, he would have shared differently. That line, like a blade, revealed a new truth. Memory of the leader had become a weapon, one each used in turn to justify their own claim. The man who had traded before spoke up at the riverbank, where distant traders had moored their boats. He held a bright green gemstone aloft and proclaimed, "I will trade for grain and reward those who pledge loyalty to me." Cheers and jeers rose simultaneously, and the air tensed as if ready to snap. The child watched, trembling. He remembered the old leader who once smashed his staff into the ground and held all silence in his palm. But now, there was no staff heavy enough to halt the unraveling. The staff had split into many staff voices, multiplied, clamoring all at once, drowning each other out. A restlessness swept through, not just the village, but the neighboring settlements too. Word traveled swiftly. That village has no leader. Now they are torn apart. Another village saw opportunity in their turmoil. If we move in, we could seize that market key. So, threats emerged not only from within, but from beyond their borders. One night, both factions convened on the riverbank. The fire burned bright, casting harsh light on tense faces. One side raised sacks of grain, the other lifted a glinting gemstone. Shouts rose. Staff hammered the earth in defiance. Among them, an elder knelt weeping, "Do not spill blood." But the youth hearts ablaze could no longer hear wisdom. In a heartbeat, a young man lunged forward, swinging his staff. The man opposite dodged just in time, but embers flew into the dry grass. Flames caught the thatched roof nearby. Screams pierced the night. Some rushed to douse the blaze. Others continued their struggle. That small fire, that first spark, became unmistakable without a unifying leader. The village risked burning itself from within. By dawn, the field smoldered in ash. Children stood staring at the blackened patch of earth, silent, too solemn to laugh. An elder sighed. "We need another leader. But this time, not just a strong one. It must be someone both sides trust." That statement planted a new understanding. Leadership wasn't just built on muscle or grain stores. It needed something greater, a symbol that rose above faction. From that yearning, history began pulling Egypt toward a new era, one of scattered communities seeking unity under a single transcendent figure. The child eyes, still recalling the old leader's stern gaze, whispered, "Will there ever be someone strong enough to plant their staff in the ground again?" So we might fall silent and listen. No answer came. Yet in that question lay a prophecy that one day there would be not just a leader, but a king. Along the river's edge, the small villages that once opposed one another now lay exhausted by endless strife. The earth cracked dry. The granaries thinned, the cattle wasted away. People began to see that if division continued, they would all be swallowed by hunger and war. And in that weariness, one thought began to grow. Only with a hand strong enough, with a loud voice, could the villages hope to endure together. This idea did not emerge by chance. Archaeological evidence from the Nakata region shows that small settlements merged into larger clusters, sharing cemeteries and uniting under common leadership. Pottery vessels from this era depict long lines of boats, not just one, but many paddling in unison, a powerful symbol of gathering into one. One misty morning, as dew clung to the riverboats from 3 villages landed alongside one another, a new leader stood at the prow, not shrouded in leopard skin like before, but wrapped in white linen, holding aloft a carved staff. He spoke not with loud command, but by raising the staff. The watching crowds fell silent, struck, as if by a symbol greater than the man himself. Under his guidance, the villages agreed to share land in seasons. When the floods came, one village sowed first. The next season, the other. The trading post no longer lay divided in two, but became a shared space where distant merchants dared to come, trusting that every village would honor their word. It was a simple first step, but vital, a first act of unity. Young people now saw the power of joining forces. They built shared dikes and dug communal irrigation canals. The sounds of hoes and stone shovels rang across the valley. Little channels began to connect fields from one village to the next. The waters of the Nile flowed through them, pooling and trickling across the lands. In sunlight, the surface glimmered like threads of silver, sewing communities into one tapestry. And the children felt it too. They played together along the riverbank, no longer divided by village lines. One child laughed aloud when a friend gifted a tiny blue bead necklace. In that innocent moment lay a profound message. Unity was not forged merely by power, but by kindness and shared memories. In the ritual, the unity was made visible. For the first time, many villages gathered upon a vast open ground. They raised tall wooden poles, hanging upon them animal hides, shells, and ornaments, signs of a shared devotion. The new leader lifted a cup of beer and offered it to the river. The prayer no longer spoke for a single village, but for all of them together. Amid the rolling music, the thunder of drums, and the wail of flutes, the community felt like one. On newly carved stones appeared scenes of processions, lines of men holding spears, not turned against one another, but facing the same direction. An eagle spread its wings on some stones, a symbol of power greater than any man. These images, discovered at Hierakonpolis, revealed a dawning thought that authority might rise above many communities, not remain within a single village. Yet not all accepted it easily. Some whispered in unease, "Will we still be free if he commands the land and the storehouses?" That shadow of doubt always walked beside unity. But most understood. There was no other road forward in an age when nature was harsh and merciless. One night, as the desert wind blew cold, the new leader sat by the riverbank. He gazed at the black waters glittering with starlight. The echo of ritual drums still lingered in his ears. He knew he had become something more than a man. He had become a symbol. A symbol cannot return to what it once was. For once people have known unity, they will never again accept division. This first unification was not yet a kingdom. There was no crown, no throne. Yet it was a turning point. Larger units, later called nomes, arose from scattered villages. And from these nomes, step by step, Upper Egypt and then Lower Egypt would be drawn together into one land. A child watched the fleet of boats depart, gliding in formation like a flock of birds. He did not know. He was witnessing history, the first time humanity grasped that true strength does not lie in single arms, but in the power to join together. At dawn, the Nile flowed in silence, mirroring the image of the united fleet. And from that reflection, a path had opened the path, from chieftain to king village to nation. Humble, earthbound graves to eternal monuments. On the wide clearing, once only the gathering place of a village, a tall wooden pole rose higher than a man's head. From it hung the pelt of a leopard, a few rings of shell, and a piece of green stone carved with the image of a bird spreading its wings. The people stood around gazing upward. No words were spoken yet, all understood. That pole was not a mere decoration. It was a sign that their community now had a center, and that center was embodied in a symbol. The new chieftain stepped forward. He carried a long staff in his hand, its tip fitted with a polished stone. He did not always wield it, but whenever the staff was lifted, his voice carried further, struck heavier. The elders whispered, "This is the staff of Ra, the sun god." Others objected, "No, it is his own staff." In that ambiguity, divine and human power began to fuse into one. Archaeology reveals that as early as the Naqada period, staffs, leopard skins, and headpieces appeared in the graves of leaders. They were not mere possessions, but emblems. People had learned that strength did not lie in muscle alone, but in the images that compelled others to bow. In great ceremonies, the leader draped himself in the leopard skin. Its black rosettes scattered across the yellow hide made him stand out against the crowd. No one else wore such a garment, only him. And so, the skin ceased to be clothing. It became a declaration, "I am not as you are. I stand above you." Alongside this, shards of pottery and stone vessels from Hierakonpolis bore the image of a falcon wings, spread talons ready to strike. The falcon soaring high and seeing far became a symbol of vision and power beyond ordinary men's reach. People began to associate the chieftain with the falcon, to see him as the one whose eyes surveyed all who governed both land and sky. That image in time would become Horus, the divine protector of Pharaoh. In Lower Egypt, the people wore red crowns, low and rounded with a raised rim symbolizing the delta. In Upper Egypt, the crown was white, tall, slender, tapering. As these communities met, the two headdresses became distinct emblems of power. And when unity finally came, the two crowns were placed one upon the other, forming the double crown, the mark of a ruler who commanded both lands. Yet in this first awakening, those symbols were only seeds. The chieftain raised his staff, sat upon a high seat, draped in a leopard skin, beneath a wooden pole hung with offerings. The crowd stood in silence. And within that silence, a truth resounded. They no longer obeyed the man of flesh and bone, but the image he carried. A boy watched the scene and whispered to his friend, "If I held that staff, would I become chieftain too?" His friend shook his head. "No, the staff does not make him. He makes the staff." Yet in those words lay a dangerous seed. Whoever seized the symbol might seize the power. And so it proved. From this moment on, history shows that the struggle for power was not only for grain or markets, but for symbols. Whoever held the staff, wore the headdress, or cloaked themselves in leopard skin was the one whose voice carried weight. From now on, blood would be shed not merely for bread, but for the unseen prize authority. In the harvest rite, the chieftain lifted a cup of beer, poured it upon the ground, and prayed for abundance in the coming year. But in the eyes of the crowd, it was not only the cup they saw the leopard skin, the staff, and the pole hung with offerings. And so faith in the gods began to mingle with faith in the man who bore their symbols. When he died, his tomb was raised, larger, lined with mud brick. Within it lay not only beer and bread, but the staff, the leopard skin, the headdress. They believed the symbols would follow him into the afterlife, affirming his rank beyond death. The tradition was born from this moment, leaders buried with their emblems of power, a practice that would endure through millennia of Egypt's history. Once born, a symbol never dies. It outlives men and endures longer than stone. It is the thread binding the first chieftains to the pharaohs, the wooden pole of offerings to the double crown, the humble staff to the golden scepter. In the sunset glow, the child looked up at the tall wooden pole and whispered, "One day there will be one who wears both the red crown and the white, who raises the staff, and we will speak with a single voice." That whisper carried on the wind like a prophecy foretelling the rise of the first pharaoh. Two lands, two crowns, sharing one river, yet divided by destiny. Morning winds swelled across the surface of the Nile. The river was no longer still, but trembled beneath the beat of dozens of oars striking in rhythm. A fleet stretched forward reed and wooden boats that once carried grain and beer, now laden with men. At their prows, spears stood upright, linen banners swelled with wind, painted with the outstretched wings of the falcon. Horns of polished bone and horn sounded low and long, drawing from the rowers a pounding cadence like drums striking against the river's skin. In the distance, another fleet advanced. Their banners bore the crocodile and the bull, and at the head of their leader shone the tall white crown brilliant under the sun. Their boats surged forward oars, lashing the water waves crashing against the banks. From afar, the two flotillas moved like walls of water, drifting slowly toward their appointed meeting ground. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Birds along the marsh fell silent, and a flock of herons burst upward from the reeds. Then suddenly, the horn sounded again, longer, deeper, heavier. The fleets quickened. Water exploded into white foam sunlight, shattered into 1,000 fragments across the waves. In that moment, there were no longer arms or oars, only a vast motion. Two tides of men, two wills, two symbols, hurtling into collision. Hulls slammed against one another. Wood cracked with a dry thunder, the sound rolling outward like a storm across the river. Banners whipped in the wind, fabric straining the falcon and the crocodile meeting in the air as if locked in combat. On the banks, the huts lay silent. No one dared gather openly to watch. A woman clutched her child in the shadows, straining to hear the horns from the river. The boy pressed close eyes wide, too afraid to ask. An old man folded his hands, eyes shut tight, lips murmuring prayers. They could not see each stroke upon the water. They only felt the ground tremble, heard the echoes as though a second river had risen to strike against the Nile. Out on the water, the clash continued. Boats crashed and rebounded, voices shouted and rolled across the waves. No one could tell who was winning. They only knew the river had turned into a living canvas. Boats pitching banners, tilting oars flung like the limbs of giants. Overhead, vultures circled, gliding slowly, not yet descending, as if waiting for the verdict. The sun climbed high, its light pouring down, until the Nile's surface blazed like a sea of fire. No one saw blood, only waves turned crimson, reflecting the fierce glare. Horns and drums merged, their origins indistinguishable, rising and rolling, as though two rival heartbeats still pulsed within the same body. Then at last the fleets began to pull apart. The banners still fluttered, but in tatters. The hulls bore splintered scars, cracks spreading across their planks. Each flotilla turned back toward its own shore, rowing in silence. There were no cries of triumph, no laments of defeat, only the heavy quiet of men who understood that the struggle was not decided and would return. That night, no one in the villages slept easily. The elders spoke of dreams in which falcon and crocodile coiled together until they fused into a single form, half bird, half beast. They believed it was a warning sign only one symbol would remain one day, and all would bow before it. Weeks later, the traces of that day still lingered. Boats were patched, banners dyed anew, yet the sound of horns and drums still reverberated in memory. Children played the clash of fleets brandishing reeds as oars shouting war cries in imitation. Through such games, the memory of battle passed to the next generation, not in blood, but in story and symbol. On a tomb wall, a stone was carved with a long procession of boats, their oars raised in unison. The collision itself was not depicted. Instead, a falcon spread its wings high above. gazing down upon the river. That image alone told the story. There was a day when leaders contended, and true power lay in the one who could make his symbol soar higher. Egypt learned a lesson from such confrontations. The river was too vast to remain forever divided, the land too wide to remain scattered. The people needed one voice, one emblem, so the boats would no longer crash together, but row in the same direction. And so, from the smoke and foam of these river battles, the image of Pharaoh slowly emerged, not merely a chieftain, but the one who wore both the red crown and the white who raised the staff, so that every boat would sail together, borne by the current of the Nile. The desert night lay still. Across the sky, the Milky Way stretched like a river of silver. Below, around a blazing fire, the community gathered, not to feast, not to dance, but to listen to a single voice, the voice of the storyteller. He was neither priest nor chieftain. He was the keeper of memory. His hair was streaked with gray, yet his eyes still burned bright. His hands moved in rhythm with his words, and when he spoke, the entire village fell silent. The firelight flickered, casting his shadow high upon the clay wall, shaping him into something more than human, half man, half god. Long ago, he began the Nile did not yet flow full, and the land lay barren. People wandered, searching for water grain and a place to rest. Herds of wild bulls still roamed free, and crocodiles claimed the riverbanks. But then our ancestors came here. They raised their tents, kindled fire, and turned wasteland into home. His voice was steady and slow, each word striking like a distant drumbeat. And as he spoke, images stirred in the minds of his listeners, ancestors setting posts, roofing huts with reeds, sowing the first seeds, beating drums to call the rain. These memories were not carved on stone, not etched into pottery, but held in the common memory preserved by this very voice. The storyteller's tone grew stronger. There were days when the floods came, the waters rising to our chests. Men and cattle climbed to rooftops, waiting for the river to fall. Yet when it receded, it left behind rich silt, feeding the fields, feeding the people. Our ancestors learned to endure weight and turn disaster into abundance. The crowd nodded, no one interrupting. They knew this was not just a story, but a lesson. Patience, acceptance, the art of turning misfortune into strength. The fire crackled. The storyteller lowered his voice. But in time, we were not alone. Others came from the desert bringing weapons, bringing hunger into their eyes. Our ancestors took up staffs, stood in line, and guarded the granaries. Some fell, but the seed was saved. And because of that today, we still have bread to eat, beer to drink. The young men by the fire clenched their fists, their hearts beating faster. They felt their blood linked to those who had stood before them. In that moment, the story made them more than individuals. It bound them into the long river of their people's life. Memory held not only wars and disasters, but joy as well. The storyteller smiled, his voice suddenly lighter. There were seasons when the granaries overflowed. People brewed wine from dates and sang until dawn. A young man danced before the crowd, and a young woman sang until her voice gave out. The moon looked down and laughed with us. And in those nights, we knew that life was not only toil, but also joy. Laughter rippled through the gathering. Even in the darkness, each person saw the shimmer in another's eyes, as if they themselves had stepped once more into those forgotten festivals. The night grew deeper. The storyteller lowered himself to the ground, his voice now solemn. Remember, what I tell you is not for today, but tomorrow. When I am gone, another will take my place, repeating every word. If not, the memory will vanish, and we will no longer be who we are. The community sat in silence. They understood that the most precious thing was not grain in the storehouse, not boats on the river, but memory. For if memory were lost, even the Nile would become a stranger. A young man listened intently at the edge of the fire circle, his lips moving as he repeated each phrase. No one appointed him yet. All knew he would be the next storyteller when the old man's voice fell silent forever. The flames dwindled while the night sky grew brighter. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, a river of memory flowing above them. The pre-dynastic Egyptians had no script to write, no stones to carve. But they had words, they had memory, they had community. That kept them standing until the first signs of writing were born. On the high ground, overlooking the river, a space had been cleared. The sand was swept smooth, and the small stones were arranged into a circle. At the center rose a great wooden pole, from which a leopard skin hung wide, swaying in the wind. Around it, the crowd gathered silent and expectant. They waited for the one they now called by a new name, the man close to the gods. The slow beat of drums began steady as a heartbeat. From behind the chieftain appeared. Across his shoulders draped the leopard skin, its fur rippling in the breeze. Upon his head rose a tall headdress of feathers. He carried a long staff in his hand, carved with the coiling image of a serpent. With each step he took, the sand yielded beneath his feet, dust rising, yet every eye remained fixed upon him. No word was spoken, yet all felt the change. This man was no longer simply the hunter, no longer merely the warrior. He had become a symbol. The leopard skin was no longer the hide of a beast he had slain, but the sign that he bore the power of the wild itself. The staff was no longer a walking stick, but a reminder that he grasped the wisdom of earth and river. A priest stepped forward, lifting a vessel of Nile water. Kneeling, he poured it upon the chieftain's feet. At once the crowd bowed their heads. At that moment, a new ritual was born, one human washing the feet of another, not because of the force of arms, but because they believed this man carried the breath of the divine. The horn sounded. The chieftain raised his staff and circled the wooden pole. Each time he lifted it, sunlight struck the carving, flashing brilliantly, and the crowd murmured in awe. To their eyes, it was no accident of reflection, but the god Ra himself, nodding in approval, claiming the chieftain as his son. A woman clasped a garland tightly in her hands among the crowd and whispered, "He brings us grain as Hapi brings the waters." A man beside her replied, "He leads us in battle as Horus spreads his wings." These murmurs gathered into a single faith. The chieftain was no longer only a man, but the messenger of the gods. As the ritual reached its height, the chieftain stood beneath the wooden pole and lifted both arms to the sky. The priest intoned the prayer, his voice drawn long and solemn. God of the sun, God of the river, God of the earth, enter into this man. Let your strength flow through his blood. The crowd answered in unison with a long cry that rolled like waves upon the shore. A wind rose from the river, whipping the leopard skin so that it snapped in the air, making the feathers tremble and quiver. Someone shuddered. Was this the gods replying? In that moment, the line between man and deity blurred. The chieftain was no longer merely leader of a tribe. He stood as the very image of a god among men. When the ceremony ended, the chieftain descended, walking between two rows of bowed heads. No one touched him. No one dared meet his eyes. He passed, leaving behind the scent of burning grass, the musk of animal hide, and in the air, a space heavy with awe. That night, along the riverbank, his name was spoken again. Some claimed they had seen the light of the sun burning in his eyes. Others swore his voice had thundered like floodwaters. Whether truth or tale, the stories spread, feeding the image of the chieftain, and little by little, in the collective memory, he ceased to be flesh and bone. He became of the gods. Such rituals did not happen once alone. With every flood, with every harvest, came offerings, came drums, came the staff raised high. And each time, the distance between chieftain and God narrowed further. From these beginnings, a new idea was born that a ruler did not reign by strength alone, but by the sacred. The Egyptians had not yet spoken the name Pharaoh, but they had already understood. To rule for generations required more than a spear. It required faith, the belief that this man was the bridge between heaven and earth. And it was that faith that opened the path to a new age, the age of god-kings. The Nile glittered in the sun. Its dark blue waters stretched wide, reflecting light like 1,000 shards of broken glass. Upon it, small reed boats drifted gently, light as bamboo leaves. They were simple, familiar vessels, linking one bank to the other and binding human life to the river. At first, people lashed bundles of reeds into rafts tied with twisted fiber. They were light, they floated well, yet they were fragile. Slowly, they learned to bind wood planks, fasten them with rope, and stretch sails woven from reeds. The boat became a moving house, gliding over the water like a giant fish. On one vessel, a fisherman cast his net. His arms, corded with strength, pulled at the rope eyes fixed upon the river's surface. The net fanned wide as it fell, circling the water before sinking slowly and deeply. Moments later, the catch burst upward, silver scales flashing in the sun. A cheer erupted across the boat. Fish was the Nile's gift, and the boat was the hand that received it. But boats carried more than fish. They bore grain, beer, and stone from far-off places. From the upper reaches came ivory, gold, and timber. From the delta came salt and dried fish. Fleets met upon the river rowers, raising their hands in greeting, exchanging goods, exchanging news. In this way, villages ceased to stand apart. They became threads in a vast network woven along the current of the Nile. During festivals, fleets gathered into long processions. Banners of linen, fluttered drums, thundered from the prows, horns echoed across the water. On one great vessel, The chieftain stood, leopard skin streaming in the wind staff of the serpent raised in his hand. The crowds on the banks roared as the fleet passed like a colossal flock of birds spreading their wings upon the river. On another boat, a young merchant traveled far from home for the first time. His heart beat fast as he looked out. To the west, stone cliffs rose stark. To the east, green fields stretched endlessly. Between them, villages chained together like beads on a cord. And in that moment, he felt it. The Nile was not merely a river. It was an endless road. Each pull of the oar was a step on the journey toward unity. By evening, the fleet reached the landing. The riverbank rang with life men unloading baskets, others pulling boats ashore, voices calling out to one another. Grain, piled high jars of beer stood stacked, and stone was heaped into blocks. All of it poured into the storehouses. All of it became strength. A single village might live by its fields, but only the river and the boats could sustain a nation. Night fell, yet the boats did not sleep. Oil lamps hung from their prows, their trembling light dancing upon the water. The waves lapped softly against the hulls, whispering like ancient voices. A rower lay on his back, eyes fixed upon the Milky Way, and murmured, "There is a river in the sky, and it too carries boats. When I die, I will sail upon that river." In such faith, the Nile was more than a bridge between banks, the passage between worlds. At times, the boat became a vessel of mourning. The body of a chieftain was laid upon it, shrouded in linen, surrounded by offerings. An escort of boats followed, drums beating slow and solemn. When the craft reached the heart of the river, the people cast white lotuses upon the water, drifting with the current. To their eyes, it was not merely a farewell, but the soul's voyage outward, sailing toward eternity. In time, the image of the boat was carved into stone, painted upon pottery, etched upon the walls of tombs. It was no longer merely a tool, but a symbol of life, community, and the journey toward the gods. The Egyptians understood that land could be divided. Villages could stand far apart, but the river bound them all together. And the boat was the shared feet of the nation. By boat, they reached one another. By boat, they dreamed of the day when all would sail in a single direction under the shadow of one king. But the boat was only half the story. The other half lay in the furnace. Dry wood, glowing embers, and the sharp scent of molten metal, a stream of light that would make axe blades sharper, spear tips stronger, and anchors sturdier against the monsoon winds. When the sails filled with wind, the village forges blazed red. From that moment, the Egyptians learned to travel farther and turn their tools for that journey into power. The fire would tell the rest of the story by the following season. In a corner of the village, near the riverbank, black smoke rose from a deep pit in the earth. A craftsman knelt beside it, blowing hard through a reed tube into the glowing coals. The fire roared to life, fierce and blazing, its heat searing the air. Within that pit, among stones and embers, something was transforming copper. A new metal rested from the depths of the earth. At first, people had known only flint and basalt, hard and sharp, yet brittle. Then, they discovered green ore in the mountains. When fed to fire, it melted into a gleaming stream. The craftsmen stared wonderfully. Stone had become a substance that could be cast, shaped, and shine like the sun. From that moment, life itself began to change. He poured the molten metal into a clay mold. He lifted it high when it cooled a thin, sharp axe head. Compared to stone, it was stronger, lighter, keener. He swung it once, and with a ringing hiss, it split wood clean in two. The crowd gasped, eyes burning with awe. For this, the copper blade was not merely a tool. It was the threshold of a new age. In the fields, farmers set copper blades on their plows. The earth broke softer, the furrows ran straighter, and seeds fell more evenly. They harvested faster, and the granaries filled higher. Their joy was not only in the grain itself, but in knowing that these new tools had opened the way to easier harvests. In the hands of hunters, copper-tipped spears flew farther, struck truer. Game fell more swiftly, more safely. In the hands of craftsmen, delicate copper knives cut flax and shaped wood with precision. Curves grew smoother vessels, more graceful. But metal brought more than tools and convenience. It carried another kind of strength weaponry. Copper spears gleamed beneath the sun. Heavy copper hammers struck with deadly force. Local chieftains soon learned whoever commanded copper commanded power. And so the copper mines of Sinai, the gold of Nubia, became fiercely contested and tightly guarded. In the festivals, a priest would lift a newly polished copper blade, his voice echoing fire from the earth, strength from the gods. Metal is the gift of Ra, to make us stronger, to make us endure. The crowd fell to their knees and shouted aloud. In their eyes, copper was not merely matter, but a miracle, a fragment of divine order granted from the heavens. Beside the furnace, a young smith panted, sweat streaming down his face. He knew the dangers of his craft, the searing flames, the choking smoke, the spray of molten metal that could scar for life. Yet in his eyes, the fire was a miniature sun, and to stand beside it was to touch the god's strength. The forge still burned red when night fell, casting its glow across the village. Passers-by stopped to watch, whispering within, "That fire lies the power of the future." And they were not wrong. Egyptian society was changing from fire, and metal tools grew sharper. Wars more fierce power, more concentrated. Carvings on the rock walls near ancient tombs show men wielding copper axes, warriors bearing copper shields. Such images were no accident. The Egyptians had come to understand that metal was the new symbol of strength, of authority. At the river port, merchants from afar marveled at the goods, piled high axe heads, spear tips, copper bracelets, gleaming bright. They traded salt shells and precious stones in exchange. And so copper became more than a village tool. It became a commodity that traveled everywhere, carrying the renown of the Nile's people to distant seas. One day, the chieftain appeared, draped in a leopard skin, at a great festival. In his hand was no longer a wooden staff, but a scepter bound in copper. The crowd erupted in cheers, for they knew that power was now a symbol and a substance gleaming beneath the sun. From that moment, copper became the sign of rule, setting the leader apart from ordinary men. Yet, fire and metal were not reserved for the chieftain alone. In every household, small copper knives sliced bread. Copper needles, stitched linen, and copper bracelets adorned women's wrists. Metal entered daily life like a new light, making things finer and more enduring. On the last night of the season, the master smith sat by the dying embers. He thought, the earth gives us grain, the river gives us water, the fire gives us strength. We are stepping into another age. And indeed, that age was the foundation from fire and metal Egypt, would move beyond scattered villages, drawing ever closer to unity, preparing the way for the age of pharaohs. One king, one double crown, and Egypt had its pharaoh. Dawn spread across the fields. Mist clung to the reeds, and from the low mud brick houses, children's laughter rang out. They ran barefoot over the cool sand, leaving tiny footprints and long, winding trails. Without summons, without plan, they gathered together like a flock of fledglings leaving the nest. On the open ground by the river, they played at throwing sticks. The sticks were nothing more than dry reeds, yet, in their imagination, they became the hunter's spear, the chieftain's staff. Their shouts and clapping rose louder than the breaking waves. One child tumbled into the sand, his back covered in dust, yet he laughed instead of crying. For play was their first lesson in courage. They also raced tiny boats made from palm leaves. Folded and bound with fiber cord, they were set upon the water. The little ships wobbled, but held fast, drifting with the current. Eyes followed them keenly. Voices cried out in cheers. The victor's joy was more than victory, the pride of a sailor who believed himself master of the Nile. In the courtyard of her home, a young girl threaded shells into a necklace. Her hands were small, but deft, her eyes intent. Her mother smiled and placed in her palm a single bead brought back from a distant market. The child squealed with delight as the necklace shone in the morning sun. This play was joy, but also a lesson of beauty, of the worth carried by things from faraway places. When parents went to the fields, the children followed. Some carried water jars, others held sickles to help with the harvest. Their hands were weak, their cuts clumsy, but no adult scolded them. For they knew every gesture was the first step toward tomorrow's mastery. In the wind across the fields, laughter mingled with the sound of falling grain, lightening the weight of labor. In the potter's workshop, children played with clay. One shaped a bull, another a fish, crooked yet full of life. The potter laughed aloud, then showed them how to spin and mold the clay evenly. Play turned into an apprenticeship. Some would become true potters. Others would carry only the memory of damp earth between their fingers and the glow of fire in the kiln. At midday, when the sun blazed, children gathered beneath the shade of palm trees. The elders told stories, not of battles, but of the gods. Ra, sailing his solar bark, Nut the sky, stretching out her arms. Horus spreads his wings in protection. The children's eyes shone bright, imagining a world larger than fields and rivers. A world watched over by divine powers. The tales planted within them a belief that even their small lives rested within the embrace of the cosmos. Some were taken to the temples where they sat quietly as priests recited prayers. They did not yet understand, but the music, the incense, the beams of light slipping through stone roofs carved memories deep. In time, they would recite those words as if they had known them since birth. By evening, the children played again. They chased one another through the village, their footsteps ringing in chorus. One climbed a date palm, gripping tightly. His skin scraped against the rough bark, yet he pressed on, eager to prove his courage. Below, friends shouted and clapped, urging him higher. When the fruit finally fell, they shared it among themselves, its sweetness spreading in their mouths and their laughter. Children learned not only through play, but through imitation. When their fathers beat drums, they struck baskets in rhythm. When their mothers wove linen, they threaded reeds through their fingers. When priests lit incense, they closed their eyes and pressed their hands together. It was all play, yet it was also silent instruction how to become a part of the community. When the moon rose at night, they lay upon their rooftops, gazing at the stars. Heads pressed close, they pointed at the brightest lights, imagining them as Horus in flight or as Ra's sunboat sailing the heavens. Their voices drifted with the wind, then softened into silence. Their dreams glittered in sleep, filled with gods in the river. Pre-dynastic Egyptian children knew no writing, no symbols carved to preserve memory. But they remembered through games, through stories, through the gestures of their parents. Each day of their lives was a lesson how to sow seed, pull a net, sing, and trust in the gods. And even as they played without care, they carried upon their shoulders an unseen responsibility to keep the lifeblood flowing into tomorrow. On the walls of ancient tombs, we see them still children, with the side lock of youth toys in hand, following behind their parents. These images remind us that children were the thread binding yesterday to tomorrow, even in the earliest societies. Through them, memory endured, faith endured, community endured. In the desert night's quiet, children's laughter still echoes like a melody that never ends. And that sound, more enduring than metal, more lasting than stone, carried Egypt forward across the generations toward the day when one king would rise above them all. The Nile was swollen with water this season. Across its surface, fleets of boats sailed in long processions, their sails billowing with wind as they drifted toward distant harbors. From the banks, the river seemed a mirror of the land itself, many branches and vessels flowing in one direction. People watched and whispered, "Like this river, perhaps we too need one who can lead the way." In the crowded markets, that thought echoed. Men who brought salt from the delta sat beside those who carried ivory from the upper river, drinking beer together. Amid laughter and bargaining, someone said, "If the villages could unite, if the chieftains no longer fought one another, how strong this land might become." Heads nodded, then fell silent. They knew it was only a dream, but one that was beginning to take shape. At the harvest festivals, the chieftains gathered. One wore a leopard skin, another a headdress of feathers, and another carried a staff carved with the serpent. They sat in a row, eyes sharp smiles, half true, half false. The people watched bewildered. So many leaders, so many symbols, they no longer knew before whom they should bow. Murmurs spread. If there were but one, then all would be clear. A storyteller rose, his voice deep and resounding. The Nile is one, though it branches into 100 streams. So too, with the land, many villages, many tribes. But only when joined together will they become strong. Like a flock of birds, if each flies alone, they scatter. But if they follow one leader, they can ride out the storm. The crowd fell silent, then broke into applause as if hearing prophecy. That night, as the fire crackled, the whispers became dreams. Some said, "A king will come stronger than all, yet more, just than all." Others added, "He will bear the emblem of Horus, the eye that watches over the whole land." The voices spread, and the dream turned into faith, though no one had yet seen the face of such a king. On the cliffs near Abydos, new carvings began to appear. A towering man, crowned, raising his weapon against his enemies. Behind him, men knelt in submission. No one knew who he was meant to be. Yet all understood this was not an ordinary man. It was the image of a single king who would unite the land. In the mind of the farmer, what would it mean? It would mean no longer fearing each flood season when a different chieftain came to demand his share of grain. In the craftsman's mind, it would mean his work traveling farther, no longer halted at tribal borders. In the priest's mind, it would mean rituals no longer scattered, but gathered at one single center, one temple, for the whole people. By the river, a young man whispered to his friend, "One day, like these boats joining into a fleet, we too will come together, and the king will be the prow that cuts the waters for us all." His friend nodded, eyes gleaming in the firelight. At a sacred offering, a priest declared, "Ra has but one son, Horus, but one pair of wings, the Nile but one source. Why then should the land have many who lead? Believe this, the gods will one day choose the one, the man who will bind the river and bind us." With it, the answering cry rose like a wave surging to the shore. That dream did not belong to priests alone, nor to chieftains. It was a common people's dream, boatmen, potters, and seed sowers. They did not know when they did not know who, but they felt the day drawing near. When the moon shone upon the Nile, its waters glittered, reflecting hundreds of small fires flickering on the banks. From afar, the flames blended into a single ribbon of light, bright as a silver thread. To Egyptian eyes, it was an omen. Many flames could become one. Many tribes could become one. Many small dreams could merge into a single great dream. And from that dream, a new longing took form, the longing for one king who would raise Egypt from scattered villages into a nation. Night descended upon the Nile Valley. The desert wind blew cold, slipping through the mud brick roofs, making the torches in the courtyards tremble. No songs were sung. No drums were struck. Silence spread across the land, broken only by the rasp of insects and the gentle lap of water against the earthen banks. People whispered to one another that this was no ordinary night. It was a night when the gods themselves were listening. In every village, the fires still burned, but their light seemed dimmer, the flames smaller and cautious, as if the people feared to disturb something vast and unseen. They sat in circles, sharing rough bread and thin beer. No one told jokes. No one raised their voice. All were waiting, though none could say exactly for what. A farmer bent low, rubbing a few grains left in his basket. He murmured to his wife, "If tomorrow there truly is one who rules, may he keep grain for the people, not only for his storehouse." His words brought silence, then nods of agreement. They all knew abundance or hunger could decide everything. In a small workshop, a smith sat before a freshly sharpened copper blade. Slowly, he wiped it clean, the metal flashing light across his worn face. A friend asked softly, "Tomorrow, will this blade protect or kill?" The smith paused, then answered, "That lies not in my hands, but in the hands of the one who will hold power." At the river's edge, merchants sat upon mats beside their goods. Salt from the North Stone, from the desert spices, from the upper river, all piled into small mounds. One sighed, "I only wish that one day, from here to the sea, there will be no more tolls and hands to stop us." Another replied, "If there were one king, the river's path would be straight and trade would be safe." Together, they looked out over the Nile, glittering in the moonlight, as though already seeing that open road unfold before them. In the clay temple at the edge of the village, a priest stood alone before the altar. Smoke from incense rose, mingling with the moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the roof. He lifted his hands in prayer, one sun to shine, one order to protect, one wing to shelter us. Grant us the one man that Mayhat may be kept upon this earth. His words echoed, and those standing outside felt a chill, as though the gods themselves had answered. That night many dreamed. Some saw a giant warrior standing amid the fields, shielding the crops from drought. Others dreamed of a great boat steered by a single hand carrying the entire village upon its deck. Still others saw a flock of birds, flying straight, no longer scattered, each following the leader ahead. Though the visions differed, their meaning was the same. There must be one to guide them. Above the stars blazed bright. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, curved like a silver river. The elders looked upward and whispered, "That is the river of the gods. We shall follow a single leader one day, just as this river runs to the sea." The young who sat beside them felt their hearts quicken, as though they stood at the edge of a great journey. It was not only human hearts that sensed change. Nature, too, gave signs. The wind rose strong, then fell into sudden stillness, leaving the air heavy and unmoving. A strange bird flew overhead, its cry echoing through the night. The moon lit every tree, every roof, every figure sitting silent. No one spoke, but all knew this night was a boundary. As the hours waned, the weight of silence deepened. Dogs barked once, then fell quiet, as if they too were listening. Children slept in their mother's arms, yet the grown sat wakeful. Their minds wandered to fields and granaries, to festivals and to war. All their thoughts pressed into one question: what will tomorrow bring? At last the first light touched the horizon. A pale crimson spread across the desert, the air carrying the warmth of dawn. The dying embers flared once more before fading. The priest stepped from the temple doorway, turned eastward, and spoke tremblingly. "The sun rises. The night is over." The people also walked to the riverbank. They looked toward the upper Nile, where mist veiled the distance. Nothing could be seen yet. All were waiting. The shuffle of feet stirred the earth, and whispers passed on the wind, and the silence was no longer the silence of fear, but of expectation. The sun rose full brilliant, flooding the waters with light, Its rays stretched across the surface like golden roads binding bank to bank, village to village. And in that moment, the people knew the night had ended and a new day had begun, the day of one king. Dawn rose, the sun blazing red as it lifted from the eastern horizon. Along the riverbank, thousands had gathered, their eyes fixed upon the open ground before the newly built temple. The wind carried the scent of incense and the smoke of burning grass. This was the day Egypt would have but one. At the center stood a wooden throne set upon a high platform. It was plain in form, yet around it fluttered banners embroidered with falcons and lotuses, the emblems of Horus, the emblems of the land. A priest, clad in white linen, head wrapped in cloth, palm branch in hand, stood solemnly awaiting the man who would ascend the throne. Drums thundered slow and deliberate. From a distance, a procession advanced. At its head marched warriors with wooden shields and spears of copper gleaming in the sun. Their steps struck the earth in unison, raising clouds of dust. Behind them appeared a tall man, Narmer, the mightiest chieftain of Upper Egypt. He wore leopard skin, and he had a tall white crown on his head, the crown of the South. With each step he took, the crowd fell silent, until only the drums beat the measure of his approach. When Narmer mounted the platform, the priest lifted a vessel of water drawn from both banks of the river, half from the southern reaches, half from the northern delta. He poured them into a single stone chalice, then offered it to Narmer. The chieftain raised it and drank. A roar surged from the people, for all understood 2 lands had become one within this man. Then the priest brought forth 2 crowns, the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt. He joined them together and placed the double crown upon Narmer's head. The multitude fell prostrate, for Egypt was no longer divided in that instant. They had a king. Narmer stood tall, raising his staff. The morning light caught upon the unified crown, making it blaze with brilliance. He spoke no long words, only bowed his head to the Nile. That simple gesture made the people believe he was more than a conqueror. The gods chose him. The priest's voice rang out in prayer. Horus spreads his wings in protection. Ra lights the path ahead. Ma'at keeps the order strong and true. From this day, there shall be but one to lead the land. The answering cry rolled back like waves upon the river, echoing far into the horizon. At the back of the crowd, farmers leaned shoulder to shoulder, sighing with relief. They believed that from this day, no longer would harvests be torn apart by rival chieftains. At the river landing, merchants clasped hands, hoping that their trade would flow down one river free of barriers. In the temple, priests bowed their heads, envisioning a single ritual for the whole people. And upon the high platform, Narmer stood silent, as if he understood that he now bore not only power, but the dream carried for thousands of years. The coronation stretched into midday. On the river, fleets of boats lined in procession, their white sails swollen, their banners snapping in the wind. Horns blared, drums rolled in rhythm. From the banks, people saw not just boats, but a river of light, the sun mirrored across the waves. That image seared into memory. Egypt's vessel had found its helmsman. By afternoon, when golden sunlight fell across the fields, Narmer walked the river's edge. His steps were slow, stopping beside groups of farmers, planting potters at their wheels, children laughing at play. He spoke no words, only nodded. Yet that single gesture made the people believe this king saw them all, the rich and the poor alike. When night descended, a great fire was lit before the temple. The crowd gathered once more, singing, dancing to the beat of drums. The tension was gone, replaced by faith. The priest stepped forth again, voice rising in chant. From this day, Narmer is our guide. His name will endure. This land, once many villages, is now one. Many dreams have become one dream. The old storyteller stood adding his voice. Once we had only small flames in each village. Tonight, those flames join into a sea of light. From tomorrow, history will remember us not as fragments, but as Egypt, the land of one king. Above the Milky Way shimmered the moon faded, but the river still glowed with firelight reflected upon its surface. Someone whispered, "This is the first night of a new age." And indeed, from the moment Narmer ascended the throne, Egypt was transformed from scattered tribes into a nation, from many chieftains into one pharaoh. The night passed, and dawn broke over the lands beside the Nile. Mist clung to the river, where moored boats stirred gently at the banks. The water lapped against their wooden sides, steady as a lullaby sung for millennia. No one could say the precise moment when everything changed, yet all could feel it. From the day Narmer ascended the throne, the land had entered a new age. Looking back, the road had been long and uneven, from the tiny villages of mud and reed, where the smoke of hearths mingled with morning fog. From the seasons of flood, when people learned to wait patiently for the waters to recede, they sowed seed into the rich silt from the nights of firelight, when song, drum, and story held the community together. All those moments, small and fragile, had gathered to form the foundations of an empire. The pre-dynastic Egyptians left more to the future than they ever imagined. They taught their children to see the river as water and as the lifeblood they shared. They showed that tools need not remain stone, that earth could yield copper through fire. They taught that death was not an ending, but a passage, so tombs were not merely graves, but vessels of memory. More than this, they learned to believe in something greater than themselves. At first, it was faith in the gods, Ra Horus, Osiris Ma'at. Later it became the belief that a man could carry divine power and rise to lead them all. From that belief, Egypt crossed into the age of pharaohs, the god-kings whose names would endure, bound forever to the pyramids and the words carved in stone. On the riverbank, an old storyteller sat among children. He said, "Long ago, we thought each village was a world. No longer. Now, we belong to a land greater, stronger. Its name will not fade, for it is bound to a king." The children listened, their eyes shining. In their minds, the land was no longer just a cluster of roofs and fields, but a country stretching wide from desert to sea. In the markets, merchants easily exchanged goods, their hearts lighter than before. They knew the river road was less hindered now, and the dream of trade reaching farther was opening before them. Farmers bent to the rice shoots in the fields, their hands steady, their lips singing ancient songs. They felt they were no longer filling only their village granary, but the granary of an entire people. In the temples, priests burned incense, their voices rising in prayer. From this day, their words were not for one village alone, but for all of Egypt. What the ancestors had begun, Narmer merely continued. Yet it was that single step which bound the fragments together. From the moment he wore the double crown, the legacy of thousands of years before him was drawn into one, transformed into unity. It is said, history does not begin with kings, but with the nameless hands that raised huts, dug canals, and planted seed. Pharaohs may carry glory, but the pre-dynastic age laid the foundation. There would be no mighty nation without the small villages that endured the floods. Without the fireside rites, there would be no temples of stone. Without the vague dream of a leader, no pharaoh would ever have mounted the throne. At dusk, a great boat cut through the river. Its sail swelled with wind. Its banners snapped in the air. On board, voices rose in song, the oars striking in rhythm. From afar, the vessel seemed to carry every dream, bridging the past to the future. To the people's eyes, it was no longer merely wood and rope, but a symbol, the ship of Egypt now launched, never to halt. Night fell again. Across the sky, the Milky Way stretched wide, bending like a river of silver. The elders pointed upward and whispered, "That is the river of the gods. We have traveled far to find the one to lead us." Now, the ship has its helmsman. From here, the journey will be longer still. The young nodded, their hearts aflame. They knew the world would bring trials yet to come. But Egypt was no longer scattered sparks. It had become a single shining thread, stretching from south to north, lit by the shared torch of a nation. And so, the pre-dynastic age closed. A new era began, yet its legacy endured. It lived in the Nile in memory, in the bricks of the first temples, in the stories told by firelight. And above all, it lived in the image of a boat gliding at dawn, the vessel that bore Egypt's dream, from the smallest village to the great empire to come. When people think of Egypt, they remember the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the dazzling pharaohs. Yet behind that splendor lies a quieter age, the long pre-dynastic centuries when every mud brick house, every small fire, kept alive the fragile flame of history. From the riverside villages, people learned how to sow seed, tell stories, and trust in something beyond themselves. The day came out of those humble beginnings when Narmer mounted the throne, placed the double crown upon his head, and Egypt became a single nation. Even now, standing beside the Nile, watching boats drift beneath the sun, one can still imagine those ancient dreams floating silently on the water. History is never lost. It lives in the river's current, the starlight, and the stories handed down. And as we listen, we too become part of that journey.